Oh boy, it's everyone's favorite time again. Time to talk about British diesels. And despite the fact that technically I have talked about this particular locomotive before, as it did appear on my top 5 worst trains ever series, because of course it did, I decided to give it its own video because it's such a weird situation. And I mean that. For full context, the research going into this particular design was started in the late 1940s, and Britain, in general, had pretty limited experience with diesels as a whole, especially where locomotives were concerned. I mean, they were aware of them, and were aware that they were becoming pretty popular, especially over here in America. We were using diesel electrics, and Germany would start messing about with diesel hydraulics. But in the UK, they were like, alright, we got diesels. How do we make them do the thing on the railway? And they weren't really sure. There were some experiments, some were more successful than others, but they really struggled for a while to make a proper road diesel, one that ran on the main line, that could handle the longer trains, opposed to shunters, which comparatively were usually simpler and easier to develop. This locomotive would eventually be known as the British Railways 10100, also known as the Fell Diesel, being named after one of its designers, Lieutenant Colonel L.F.R. Fell. And despite having a British Railways designation, I can't actually blame them this time. This wasn't really their fault at all. They weren't a thing when the development was going on. They just inherited this thing, and weren't really thrilled with it in any way. This was a collaborative effort between Fell Developments Limited and H.G. Ivatt, who was the chief mechanical engineer of the London, Midland, and Scottish Railway. So this was an LMS project. And the goal was not only to make a diesel locomotive that could handle the main line, but also to address perceived weaknesses in diesel traction, at least as far as the British saw them. And one of those big weaknesses was that, well, here in America, for example, we were using diesel electrics. But a diesel electric drive does have some inherent flaws technically because of the conversion between the diesel and the electric drive. Which is why the 10100 wound up not having a conversion at all, and it was a diesel mechanical design. Oh, there's a sentence that I don't get to say very often. Diesel mechanicals aren't, well, unheard of, but they're usually, for one thing, a lot smaller, and for two, they're not very popular for a variety of reasons. Mostly because in order to get a direct drive diesel to work, it requires a pretty confusing setup in a locomotive sense. It can be difficult to make the diesel develop very high torques at low rotational speeds. Diesel electrics don't really have that problem, so in order to make this work, they had to highly supercharge the engines at the low speeds and drop that off progressively as the speed rose. But that on its own was going to be complicated, and really, just ask us how the diesel electrics were working. I mean, you don't have to do, you're going to do this? Okay, fine, whatever. And I assure you, this thing wound up way more complicated than it ever should have been. Because no, to say that the Fell was bad would be a massive understatement because it was really bad. It was built at Derby Works in 1951, and under the white notation would be a 484. Yes, it had leading and trailing wheels. And side rods. Okay, if there was ever a sign that they didn't know how diesels were supposed to work, that was it right there. But technically, she should have been able to reach a speed of 84 miles per hour with a power output of 2,000 horsepower and a tractive effort of 25,000 pounds of force. Not bad, all things considered. But the way she worked was absolutely friggin' insane. I already mentioned the supercharging element, but in order to make any of that work, they had to get, well, I was about to say creative, but personally, looking at this and reading through it, I'm convinced that everyone involved with developing the way this engine operated was simply a crazy person. That's where I'm at with it. That's where we're going. She used differential gearing to transmit her power. like a truck. Okay. And originally, yes, she had side rods, which connected the center 4 pairs of driving wheels. But the ones in the center were later removed, and to answer the question as to whether or not that made her a 4-4-4-4, no, because the 4 axles were still being driven by a single gearbox, so they were still unified, they just weren't, obviously unified. I don't even know what's going on with the side rods, to be honest. Given she provided 2,000 horsepower, she would have been the most powerful non-steam locomotive on the rails in Britain at the time, and she was put on expresses in 1951, proving that she was actually pretty powerful. Another reason they wanted to go with the mechanical drive is that it allowed them to make her a lot lighter. They were also worried about loading gauge, so that was one point in her favor. But as I mentioned, the way she worked was completely psychotic. She had 4 main Paxman 12R PH 12-cylinder engines. Each one of these engines produced 500 brake horsepower at 1,500 RPM. Each of those individual engines was then connected to the gearbox via hydraulic couplings, which did not make her a diesel hydraulic, do not ask that, they just had hydraulic couplings in there. Those could be filled with oil to transmit power or drain to disconnect that engine from the actual transmission if need be. The outputs were combined in pairs using 2 different sets of differentials, and the output shafts from the differentials were combined by a 3rd differential. Sorry. A 3rd differential to drive the main output shaft. Each individual differential input shaft was provided with its own mechanism to prevent backwards rotation when the couplings were actually drained, because that would be bad. But that could cause the Fell's drive mechanism to lock up if she were pushed backward. So they also incorporated a vacuum-operated clutch with the gear train to prevent that issue. Now you're wondering, okay, she had 4 different engines and 3 different differentials, all connected through some nonsense. Why? And what? And how? And, Okay, alright. Fair questions. To begin with, I hope you're taking notes. There'll be a quiz later, because I'm not even halfway done with this. The effect and intention of the arrangement was that the gear ratio between each engine and the output shaft depended on how many engines were actually being used to drive the transmission in the first place. They didn't technically change gears with the Fell in the way you would do that in a car, for example. It was all by filling or draining those hydraulic couplings to connect or disconnect the engines entirely. For example, if only one of the hydraulic couplings was filled with oil, that would mean only one engine was actually connected. The other 3 would be disconnected, and their input shafts to the transmission were locked by the one-way clutches. Operating in the state of single-engine drive gave her an effective gear ratio of 4-1. If she added a second, that would be 2-1. With 3, it would wind up with 1.33-1, and with all 4 running, she had unity. The effective gear ratio of the Fell was inverse to the number of engines driving her, which is ridiculous, but alright. She didn't have any overall torque multiplication effect from selecting a lower gear. The 4-1 mechanical advantage afforded to the single engine driving in the first gear was actually completely canceled out by the fact that, well, she only had 1 engine running. And 1 engine only gives her so much power. So like, you have, like, the torque change, which is what you're going for, but you still only have 1 engine here. And that's not really doing it in certain contexts. So bad was that particular issue that the maximum output torque from the transmission would amount to being effectively the same as was available if they were running with all 4. And the same ratio applies effectively to the 2nd and 3rd gears. That meant that the transmission of this locomotive, unlike any other locomotive transmission in the friggin' world, and in history, didn't actually give any means of matching the torque characteristics of the engines whatsoever. It didn't help when it came to, meeting the requirements of the locomotive in a given situation, and it didn't actually provide for an increased torque output at low speeds for starting and hill climbing. The only purpose of the transmission in this thing was to match the output speed of the engines, the rotational speed, to the requirements of the locomotive. Not the torque, not anything else. That's all it was for. So, basically, it wasn't doing at all what any other transmission would do in the context of, well, how you would use a transmission, whether it be in a locomotive or a car or anything. But that leaves the question, okay, well then how were they handling the torque? Because they needed to do that. Okay, here's how they answered that problem. Because they needed high starting torque, instead of utilizing some kind of normal transmission, because that wouldn't be insane, they instead chose to alter directly the torque characteristics of the engines themselves. In a normal diesel engine that isn't built by a bunch of people that have stopped taking their antipsychotic medication, you get the charge at a mass flow rate proportional to the rotational speed of the diesel engine. The faster the rotation, the more charge it can aspire, which leads to a power output curve, which rises roughly, not quite exactly usually, but roughly, linearly with the rotational speed of the engine. It will eventually flatten off as it reaches limits of the engine model, but that's generally how it works. But in the FEL, no. Her engines got their charge from Root's blowers, which are positive displacement lobe pumps, which are operated by pumping a fluid with a pair of meshing lobes resembling a set of stretched gears. But in order to operate these blowers, they needed to install two auxiliary engines, which were governed in a way that when the traction power demand was more than the minimum, they would run at what was effectively a constant speed. Root's blowers are positive displacement devices, but that meant that in the FEL, the mass flow rate at which the charge was being delivered to the main engines was not dependent on the speed of the main engines whatsoever. It was dependent only on the auxiliary engines, meaning that the power output of the main engines was completely defined by the auxiliary engines at all times. And because the speed of the auxiliaries was constant, the main engines had a power curve that was constant with rotational speed. Power is the product of torque and rotational speed. Okay, that's how that works. So the main engines, therefore, had a torque curve inversely proportional to speed. And that did, to be fair, result in a maximum torque at a low speed, which went down as the speed increased, which is exactly what they had been trying to do. It did technically do that, but, now that I have completely explained all this nonsense, and all this madness, I have a simple question for you. I told you there'd be a quiz. And the question I have for you all to answer is, why? What was all that? What is this? Why are you... What? That is some nonsense. The over-engineering, the complexity. This is ridiculous. You can't tell me they all looked at this and said, yes, absolutely. This is clearly the future of locomotive technology, because this isn't the future of any technology. There's too much going on here. You got 6 different engines in this thing. 6! 2 are auxiliary and are required in order to actually give the main engines their power output in effect. Are diesel electrics a joke to you? Couldn't you have done anything but this? This is outrageous, and it's one of the main reasons why diesel mechanicals are so rare when it comes to locomotives, because it involves some nonsense or it's so dirt simple that it's hilarious, because technically chain drives can be diesel mechanical. And at least there, all you're doing is attaching a chain to one of the axles, or possibly 2. The Australians did that all the time, and that's questionable as well, but at least that had the benefit of being easy to understand and maintain. Like, it's pretty obvious how that's working. This is absurd. And how did she perform, I bet you're wondering? Well, British Railways did give her a chance. It wasn't their project, but they inherited her, and they were like, all right, let's see what she can do. And when she was working, she did work, but outside of maintenance being just the worst on her, just horrifying, In July of 1952, her gearbox got completely shredded to pieces. How? A bolt? Yeah. One of the bolts was left too loose after some maintenance and fell out and directly through the gear train and just destroyed it. The damage was so bad that she remained out of service for over a year. And it was about that time that British Railways was like, this is not gonna work. This can't be the diesels we've heard about from across the pond. Like this great new diesel technology the Americans are so hung up on. Like this ain't it. This ain't it, guys. We're just saying. And yeah, they were right. It wasn't it. Not whatsoever. They had actually been entertaining an improved version of the Fell for further testing, but they canceled that after this whole bolt incident. But they still kept her around for a few more years. She still could move, and once they fixed her, she was fine. So she stayed in service till October 16th, 1958, but that's when she suffered another cataclysmic failure. To be fair, having nothing to do with her crazy transmission. It actually had to do with her steam heating boiler. She was equipped with a steam boiler. Why? Well, a lot of early diesels had that. For passenger service, because old passenger cars used steam heating because they were pulled by steam engines, which had steam. That makes sense. So when they started switching over, they still needed to provide heat to the coaches, so early diesels had small steam boilers there to provide that heat until they got more modern coaches that just use electric power from the diesel usually. So, yes, she had one, and hers caught fire while she was sitting at Manchester Central. It was great. It's just wonderful. She burned to a crisp. It was fantastic. She was moved back to Derby Works and not fixed. She was stripped down for useful components and then eventually scrapped in July of 1960. British Rail, for their part, would go on to invest in more logical diesel choices, such as diesel electrics and hydraulics. And many of them turned out terrible, but that's because they didn't bother testing them. Say what you want about the Fell, British Rail did decide to actually test her. She didn't work, but unlike the future diesels they would invest in during their modernization plan, they didn't just order 87 of her and just throw her out in the main line and hope for the best because they were panicking. With her, they did test and looked at the results and said, wow, no, we're not, absolutely not. To date, I don't think there's any other diesel that's ever been constructed in history that works quite like the Fell did. She's definitely a perplexing and unique beast, which is why I wanted to dedicate an entire video to talking about her, because just discussing the way she handled a transmission and the auxiliary engine nonsense, I mean, this was ridiculous. But I'm kind of sad she was destroyed. If she were preserved, she'd definitely be a curiosity, worth seeing in a museum. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.